Hey, welcome back to Transform Your Workplace. I'm your host, Brandon Laws, and today we're diving deep into the labor market with economist Mallory Vachon. This is a must listen for any HR professional, leader, or anybody trying to navigate the current economic landscape. Mallory brings a very unique perspective on the trends that are shaping today's workplace, and we cover everything from talent shortages to rising costs of compensation and even the impact of remote work on hiring dynamics. We also break down what it means to enter a normalization period post-pandemic and discuss how generational shifts are reshaping employee expectations, and whether it's the challenges of attracting Gen Z talent or navigating the high interest rate environment. Mallory's insights are going to provide you actionable takeaways for your organization. Before we get into the conversation, I want to shout out our sponsor, Xenium HR. They've been instrumental in supporting learning and development programs for supervisors and leaders, and they're helping them stay ahead of the curve. So if you're interested in growth for you or your people, check out Xenium HR's learning and development programs for 2025. They're designed to empower supervisors with the skills they need in today's workforce. Before we get into the conversation with Mallory, don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you're not subscribed to this show, and feel free to share this episode with somebody who can get value from it. And if you'd be so kind to give us a rating and review on your favorite podcast app, we would love the support. All right, let's get into the conversation with Mallory Vachon. Mallory, it is such a pleasure to have you on Transform Your Workplace. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Brandon.
You're an economist. We're going to talk about the economy, the labor market. A lot of HR professionals who listen to this podcast will be very interested to hear about what your take is on the labor market. A lot of people are uneasy right now. I think the economy is kind of funky right now. There's been a lot of shifting lately. A lot of chatter around the economy and where we're at. But what's like one trend that you see from your vantage point that people are underestimating right now?
So I would definitely feel that when we're talking about HR, talent acquisition professionals, I feel like they've felt the brunt of some of the changes that we've seen in the economy over the last 6 to 12 to almost 24 months. Now, I think there's a couple of things to note there. We're in a period, our theme for this year and through the beginning of 2025 is just normalization. HR teams were strapped with hiring. We had one of the biggest job loss events in, a generation. And HR teams were tasked with rehiring all of those 20 million folks that had lost their jobs during the pandemic. And now we're in a period of normalization. We've had a lot of high profile layoffs, in the technology industry and a lot in media. There's been some unrest with labor movements that have kind of changed the landscape a little bit as well. But we were adding jobs at such a quick pace, and the HR, profession was tasked with so many things: remote work, hybrid work, the Great Resignation. And now we're in a period of normalization. So, over the last 12 months or so, we've added jobs at about 200,000 jobs a month pace, which looking back historically is pretty strong. But when you've gone from adding 14 million jobs in 12 months to 200,000 in 12 months, or to 2 million in 12 months, that feels like a big change. And we're really headed for a period of normalization in the labor market, which for some by industry might feel less strong than others.
Yeah, HR people are pretty busy over the last few years. They're probably exhausted.
Yes.
Over the last few years, I've been hearing this quiet quitting pop up a lot. And every time I go on LinkedIn, there's talk about burnout. Is this a common trend or a theme that you're seeing within just the people? Or is this like a larger shift in how people are thinking about work?
I feel like there's a couple of things going on there. One, there are really fun buzzwords to say, quiet quitting, the great stay, the great resignation. These are buzzwords that get you trending on LinkedIn, which is, So one of the things, if you're a content creator, which I consider myself, I'm a chief economist, but also part-time content creator, and like to provide insights for my audience, which is similar to yours, all HR. So there are some buzzwords, but I do think that there have been some generational shifts that we're seeing in the workforce. Right? We've got Gen Z workers who are kind of coming into the workforce after graduating from college or being in high school during a pandemic, which is not something that I can relate to. And I think really seem to want different things from their job and career than millennials, Gen X, baby boomers. We've seen, they're much more kind of mission driven. We've seen a lot on focus on values, quality of life over money and promotions. I think there's a great article recently in Business Insider about Gen Z workers not wanting management roles and what that means for succession planning in US businesses, and how do you move your business forward with a generation of workers who want something different from the labor market than previous generations or than their bosses might have. And while you could agree or disagree on that take and on their feelings, it's doesn't make them any less valid or true.
Yeah, that generation, I think, is confusing a lot of leaders. Like, what do they want? What makes them motivated? And what's like the stigma you hear around this generation that you want to kind of debunk right now?
I wouldn't say necessarily a stigma. I think it's just there's going to be a change. Every generation has faced their own sets of challenges and witnessed the world through different sets of eyes. And business leaders, I think we really need to wrap our minds around how to make the best decisions for our business while providing a workplace that the younger generation wants to be a part of and wants to work in, because we are facing, and we talked a little bit about Gen Z and baby boomers, but like over the last 20 years or so, we've seen our over 65 population has increased by about 21 million. Our under 18 population has increased by less than 1 million. We are facing a talent shortage in, the short and longer term. So, these workers will play an instrumental role in how our businesses continue to grow in the next 5, 10, 15 years.
I'm an upper millennial, and I remember like getting into the workforce and all these articles were talking about millennials, this and that, and just overgeneralizations. And I see the same thing happening with this Gen Z. At the end of the day, the workforce is going to keep aging, and you're going to have to grow and develop this generation, which will eventually become the next set of leaders in your organizations, be running your companies. So the more we can talk about like how to motivate these people, what drives them, and then to tap into that, like we're going to unlock something.
Completely agree. And as an older millennial myself, graduating right in 2009 at the peak of the Great Recession in the Northeast.
The weirdest economic time ever. I thought everything was going to be bleak forever.
I would not be the chief economist if it were not for such kind of a tumultuous labor market at the time. So, you could say that things ended up working out, but certainly those 2009 to 2012 was a challenge for young people in the labor market. And we're seeing some of that now, a different type of uncertainty and uneasiness now.
Compensation. I know you're an expert in this area. Compensation costs are rising. I think the appetite for higher wages is there too, with just price inflation. Life is expensive. As employers, how do we keep up with the rising pressure of meeting the demands of our employees, but also the just rising costs of doing business in general? Like, this is a very complicated subject. Maybe shed some light on what we can do.
Yeah. It's a really big challenge, and it's been one of the biggest challenges that I hear from clients and just folks who are leaders in the HR and talent acquisition space over the last couple of years. One thing I think is really important to note that we really don't see, at LaborIQ, our forecast going forward. We're not likely to hit a return to that 2 or 3% annual wage growth going forward. Number one, the talent shortage that we've talked about, that will put a little bit of pressure on wages. And then there's a lot of other inflationary pressures going on in the labor market that are likely to keep some of the pressure to keep wages higher. And given some of the tightness in the labor market, we're seeing turnover not quite come down as much as we'd expect. and businesses using compensation as a retention tool in this tight labor market that we face. I think those are a few of the challenges when it comes to compensation. The other piece is not everything is compensation driven. There, especially with the younger generations, there isn't as much of a focus. There's the focus on the workplace culture and values and other things. But at the end of the day, businesses who are focused on attracting and retaining talent are going to need to make sure they're offering a competitive compensation package or other sets of benefits that will attract and retain their workforce.
Compared to historical times, are wages keeping up with price inflation?
So over the last, 6 to 12 months, the answer is yes. So there's been some relief there. But looking back to 2021, 2022, where wages were growing at 5-7% and prices were growing at 9-10%, you had a period of time where prices were just growing faster than wages because businesses just couldn't keep up. And it also depended on what you were purchasing at the time, right? If you were trying to buy a new car in 2022, that was a big expense. If you already had a car, you didn't need a new one, you weren't necessarily facing the pressures of that. But I think there's a couple of misconceptions that sometimes happen with inflation is that just because inflation is coming down does not mean that prices are going down. So it means that prices are growing at a slower rate. Things are still more expensive, but fortunately, and it will take a little bit of time to feel, the slowing down in price growth, but things are still more expensive than they were 2 years ago or 3 years ago. The prices for, goods and services are not increasing at the rate that they were before, and they're not increasing faster than wages.
How do interest rates play a role in all this? Because, as we sit today, interest rates are pretty high. So it means buying a home, buying a car, all these things are a lot more expensive. And that puts pressure to probably make more money, or it just completely diminishes demand for certain goods, which is it's intentional, right? So just kind of walk me through how high interest rate environment can impact compensation pressures.
It's a tightrope walk, right, for consumers and for the government and for the Federal Reserve, because one of the reasons that the Fed increased interest rates was because of inflation, right? There's kind of this catch-22 where wages are going up, which is good, but when people have more money in their pockets, they spend more, which increases demand, which makes prices go up. So the Federal Reserve has tamped down some of that demand. We're still seeing prices and wages go up a little bit more inflationary than the Fed would like. There tends to be this balance, but it does make certain things more complicated. And, buying a car, buying a house. I unfortunately had to buy a new car recently and had to trade in, my old car when I had bought it had a 1.5% interest rate. And had that paid off and had to get a new one at 6%, I certainly felt that difference.
Yeah, I feel you on that. With a home being at, I think, at 3% is what I'm at, and then the car being 1%, I'm locked in forever until I'm forced to change. I think a lot of people are in that same situation where probably not a lot of movement with some of this stuff until interest rates come down.
Exactly. And I think one of the underappreciated aspects of the high interest rate environment is what you said. You're in a 3% mortgage. If you're to look for a new job or had to move for some reason, your spouse or to be closer to family, you're looking at a completely different mortgage and home buying landscape, and it becomes a much different calculus. So you can see there's a big push and a lot of headlines about coming back to office, but some of the housing market dynamics that we're seeing right now, and combined with what we've seen in the labor market, may necessitate, or it might just not be possible to find the talent unless they are in some sort of hybrid or remote flexibility arrangement.
Yep. I am so glad you brought that up, because that was going to be my next question is because of the pandemic, a lot of companies were experimenting with remote work, hybrid work environments. Some are being very bold and saying come back to the office. Whereas what I just described was I'm locked into my mortgage and I'm probably not going to look for employment in a different geographic region unless it's remote work. So give me your perspective on what is the economic impact from a remote work environment, hybrid work environment, and just where we're at today?
So I think one of the biggest factors that is actually going to impact how the longevity of hybrid and remote work is actually labor force growth. So, and migration within the United States. So there have been all these headlines of folks moving to, I am in the DFW, Dallas Fort Worth metro area, one of the fastest growing areas and states in the country in Texas. And we've attracted a lot of talent from places like California and New York. Florida has gained increased in population. That tends to be an older, less likely to be in the labor market, more retired population, but still has gained a lot in population. But for businesses in areas that have lost talent, when they're talking about bringing people back to work, or they're in a position where they're expanding, they're hiring again, they might not be in a position to find talent in their local area, and they may be forced to look in a place like Texas or Florida or North Carolina, Sunbelt states, Arizona, where the population has just increased a lot. And I think for folks that are in growing labor markets, you have an opportunity to tap into your local talent, but you also face the risk that folks are still getting poached for remote work. I think there was a study out, in the last couple of months or so, when you survey a lot of large businesses in the US, they don't really expect to see a big downward shift, I guess, like reduction in remote or hybrid work over the next 5 or so years. So there are headlines, big tech companies, Amazon, I think, back 5 days in the office, that get a lot of attention. But in reality, it seems like we're probably in a little bit of a steady state when it comes to hybrid and remote work.
You said earlier that there's a labor shortage, and I'm curious if that's just truly like lack of people, or if it's a lack of skill sets that are in high demand. And what are some of those skills that are in high demand, if that's the case?
Yeah, it really is just a lack of people, right? So our population just has not been growing at the rate that it had over the last, several decades. We're starting to slow down. Trends that you see across the world, across Europe, across parts of Asia, where birth rates are lower, people are living longer, and you end up with these shifts in the demographic makeup. The United States has been fortunate, and one of the reasons we've been able to continue to grow our economy and folks have been able to hire, one of the main things contributing to our population growth is our immigration. So this can tend to be a political issue, but when you talk about it, it's really a numbers game. In order to continue to meet the demand that businesses have and for businesses to continue to grow, we're going to need to tap into other sources of labor, and that typically tends to be through immigration to the US.
Yep. I'm no economist, but I did go through a period in my 20s where I read a ton of economics books. And one of the authors that I liked, and he was kind of an alarmist, was Harry Dent. He talked about the aging population and just like how demographics play a huge role in the economy. And one of the things he highlighted, I think was it Japan or China, just how the aging population like completely stalled their economy. And I kind of see it with the United States. To your point, it's like we're aging, but nobody's having kids, and then we don't have the immigration. How is that going to play a role in the future of the United States and the labor market?
I think the reality, like I said, this tends to be a political hot button topic, but the reality is that we will have to rely and improve on our immigration system because we do still have a really strong economy. I was reading something this morning. When you look at GDP growth over the last 30 or 40 years, the US, or GDP growth per capita, the US far outpaces kind of our Western peers. The economy has been really strong, which has been able to, help us attract migrants to continue to grow and build our economy. But that just will continue to have to be something that we rely on if we want to keep growing. We don't have a population that is growing it fast enough to increase our labor force on our own.
What's funny, it seems like we're talking at both sides of our mouth in some ways. Like I always hear like the headlines of AI is going to take your job and all this automation, but we're just talking about labor shortage. So it's like, what are we to believe right now? Like, I think a lot of people are scared about like technology and how it's going to come for our jobs, but I'm not seeing it.
I think I would tend to agree with you there. I think when it comes to AI, there are going to be certain types of jobs that change fundamentally because of that technology. And we've seen that, at any point in history, we've been at a time where there is a new technology on the horizon that's about to disrupt everything. And so at this point where that might be AI, I think given some of our challenges, we said in demographics and population growth in our labor force, there may be some jobs that end up kind of being absorbed by AI, but there should be enough demand in the economy for other folks to be able to continue to work without having a major disruption, because we need ways to make working more efficient in order to just keep up with our demand and our growth path that we've been on.
Forever, I've worked inside of an HR consulting company forever. 16 years is actually as of yesterday. And a lot of HR people, they talk about attracting and retaining talent. It's like, this has been the same theme every single year. It's like, we need to attract the right people. We need to retain our people. And we're just now talking about labor shortages. And I'm curious, from your perspective, what are the difference makers in terms of how do we keep the top talent in our organizations and not let them go somewhere else? Like what's going to move the needle?
We talked earlier about culture. I think that's really important, focusing on your values, focusing on hiring folks that will fit within your organization and are able to grow and are hungry to grow in your organization. I think that's important. One of the main reasons that people are looking for other jobs is compensation, right? If you don't feel like you're fairly compensated for the work that you're doing, it's one of the number one reasons we see for folks looking for new opportunities. There's been a big push. So it started with legislation. We had pay transparency, but the tide has now shifted where workers are wanting that themselves. Workers want comp structures to be established. They want a compensation strategy. They want to understand their career trajectory, and they want to understand how much they're making now and make sure that that is fair in the market.
Talk to me about the gig economy. So full transparency for listeners and for you, I've worked full time for Xenium HR. I love my job, executive level now. I've also run my own marketing business for 11 years. I know I'm not alone in having a side hustle. I just came back from a trip in Miami. My Uber driver on the way back has a full-time job as an IT leader, and he was driving cars on the weekend. So I'm not isolated. This guy's not isolated either. Talk to me about the gig economy and why this is popping up. And is this a trend? And how does this all relate to the compensation issue we were talking about?
Yeah, I think, there's a few different things. Part of it relates to, the culture, what do you want out of your job? What do you want the flexibility? Do you want to be your own boss? I kind of thrive in a 9-to-5 structure. I'm at a startup, so we get a little, but I have a lot of freedom, and I'm, in a leadership role. But there are people that want to set their own schedule. They want to set their own time. They want to become an expert in their area and share those talents. And I think that's just a reaction to trends that we've seen in the labor market over the last several years, even decades of just challenges. A lot of millennials, we talked about the 2008, 2009 financial crisis that may have had a lot of people, I want to be in control of my own business, my own job. I don't want to work in a corporate structure. Or with the pandemic, you have, life is short. I want to be able to travel and work and do all of these things and have my family at the same time and have that flexibility. And I think clearly the gig economy helps provide people with that opportunity. At the same time, businesses need talent as well, but they're, then can hire someone freelance to do marketing or, their other functions, social media, marketing, accounting.
Every year we put together this event. It's called the Leadership and Economics Summit. And we always have this local economist in the Portland area come and give a talk. And it's always funny, like there's like 300 people that we get registered every year. And it's funny to have them come and they want to hear what the predictions are. And as an economist, I want to get your insight is how hard is it to predict where the economy is going to go in the next year? And then maybe give some predictions about what we should be focused on in the next 12 to 18 months.
Elephant in the room. We have an election going on. People are voting on Tuesday, November 5th. There will be, the final day of voting for the presidential election. And in January, we're going to have a new president. So with, a complete, change, given that the current president is not running for office. And so I think for a lot of businesses, that creates a little bit of uncertainty. But I would say when you think about the U.S. economy, there's a very common metaphor that it's an aircraft carrier. There's a lot of inertia. It takes a lot of shocks to the system to really change that inertia, right? You have a pandemic and all of a sudden, turns things on its head. You have a financial crisis that was a little bit more slow rolling, but continued to turn things on its head. Right now, we're getting into that period of normalization. Over the next 12 months, and certainly over most likely the next presidential term, whoever takes office in January, we will see lower job growth and lower total job creation than we did over the last 4 years, if only because we were recovering from a pandemic where we lost 20 million jobs. And so we were just recouping a lot of that. And so just my guidance to folks is that prepare for each candidate's potential sets of policy priorities, but it will take 6 to 12 months for those administrations to get staffed up, for them to kind of fully flesh out their policy priorities. And it'll also depend on what the structure of the government looks like. Do we have all one party, and how what are the margins and how they can get their policies enacted?
Well, Mallory, this has been a really fun discussion. If you could leave people with a thought or an action item as to prepare for what's to come, I'd love to hear it.
I would say don't panic. We are in a period of normalization. There are certainly some industries that have been hit harder than others. The good news is that we haven't seen widespread major job losses, but a lot of industries are really in that treading water. Someone might leave for a new role, or you have a few layoffs, but maybe you backfill some of those positions in a different department, or you backfill a little bit more slowly. But we're headed toward a period of normalization. So just don't panic about that. There tend to be a lot of headlines that are hyperbolic. Oh, hiring was down substantially over last month, and it's like a few thousand jobs. So learn to read the data. Follow me on LinkedIn, follow LaborIQ on LinkedIn. We write a lot of content geared toward labor market and HR and TA leaders. So just learn to read the data, don't panic, but prepare for this extended period of normalization.
My guest today has been Mallory Vachon. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Brandon.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in for today's episode of Transform Your Workplace. The content on this show is strictly for general information and educational purposes only, so that you can go transform your workplace in a positive way. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the show are the guest's own and don't represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of either Xenium HR, the sponsor of the show, or me, the host, Brandon Laws. Additionally, Xenium HR or myself, Brandon Laws, doesn't endorse any guest, their business, or any organization they represent, so discretion is advised. We encourage you to work with a trusted advisor to find a custom approach that fits your organization's needs. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode.